Hey guys, we're going to have our next discussion on globalization today. If you have thoughts on these videos, you can post them in the comments section and I will respond to you and we can have a nice little discussion. Or you can also share it on Facebook and you and your friends can talk about it as well to kind of see their thoughts on these issues. And you might be surprised at the feedback that you get because people like to talk about things like this. Anyway, for today's discussion, I want to talk about a very specific dance example, which is a little bit different from the ones that I've done in my other videos. This one is a video that I watched. I actually saw this video on Facebook. Somebody shared it, and I thought it was just absolutely beautiful. But it's also a good example of globalization. So, because I know that everybody in the world has not seen this video, I'm posting the link to this video in the description to my video. So go watch the video and then come back and we'll talk about it because that'll help you kind of gain some context, okay? So this dance video it's an American song, Shape of You by Ed Sheeran, but it's not in English, it's in Hindi. And the dancers are all from India. And this was just a really awesome video because it was beautiful, but it was also kind of a fusion between some traditional Hindi dance moves and also some American lyrical kind of ballet moves as well. But they orchestrated it phenomenally, and the video turned out really, really beautiful. And so I figured there's some good aspects of this video that we can see globalization kind of in here, and we'll talk about that. First, I want to talk about the idea of culture. From the dawn of time, people have kind of had this argument, like, we all have human characteristics. Are they given to us in nature, or is it something we learn? Is it nurture? And there's been a lot of discrepancies. Like, there are some characteristics that basically all humans do have, but there's also a lot of differences in the actions that people take depending on where they grow up, where they live, and that's culture. I think for culture, you can pretty safely say that it's all learned. From the time we grow up, people teach us how to talk, people teach us how to react, how to think about things, and we just learn it and we intake it because that's what we're around, that's what we see, and it just feels normal to us. And those things become our culture. And we don't think that it's weird. It's kind of like that's what we run on. When we enter a new situation, we think of it a certain way because of what we've been taught to do our whole entire lives. It's kind of like the software that a computer has. Our brain is like a big computer, and as it runs into new things, we use that software to kind of play out those situations. This is something that's very obvious in the world, just because what's normal to you might be something totally unnormal to somebody else. Like, somebody could look at it and say, it's really peculiar that you handle it this way because I'm taught to handle it this way. It doesn't mean that either one is weird or wrong. It just means that different areas of the world have different cultures, and that's okay. But this is really, really seen in the Shape of You video, because what they were trying to do was take something that's very traditional and indigenous to that area of the world, and they kind of took it and changed it into something a little bit more modern. And this is a really good example because it shows that there are a lot of different ways that you can do this in the world today, and it shows how we can incorporate our own traditional values into the world today and not just leave them behind as the world globalizes. So how they did this was by taking more traditional dance moves, the way they held their fingers or head movement, things that are very traditional for India, and incorporating them into a more modern dance style. And it's still very representative of their culture, but it's just a little bit different from how it was in the past, and that's okay too. There's definitely a lot of mixing and blending going on here because as the world is more interconnected, you cannot stay isolated from the rest of the world, so there's obviously going to be learning. And I think that's why they used Shape of You by Ed Sheeran, because that's an American song. But they changed it and made it a little bit of themselves, you know. They changed it into their own language and added some little extra parts here and there, and it's totally hybridized, but that's what they wanted to do for their video. But it's a good example of how you can hybridize something and make it your own in a positive way, I think. A lot of times, something that people talk about in hybridization is symmetry, because if you take culture A and culture B and then the people kind of merge together, there's going to be a mixing and blending happening. But it's not always going to be 50% of this culture and 50% of that culture bind together and make one new culture of 100%. You know, that's just never going to happen. So there's always going to be an asymmetry. And I think it's impossible to gauge it and say, oh, it's 37% American because of the song, but it's 63% whatever, you know, because that doesn't work. And how do you decide what is defined by that label and what isn't, you know? But the fact of the matter is that there is an asymmetry that always exists when mixing and blending, and it kind of has to do with power and culture. So since the Hindi culture is very prominent in India, I think the traditional Indian aspects kind of had a little bit more presence within this dance. But it's also because as that mixing happens, you kind of get this trans-local culture that comes about. Yes, they have very present Indian culture there, but as the United States is more globalized and kind of has their impacts on it, they don't ignore it, but it just kind of changes a lot of little tiny details, or in some cases bigger, but they might have American words that they use sometimes, or McDonald's, or you know, other things. But this is also seen in the dance, and that's going to be a kind of mix of the migrant culture as well as the indigenous population culture joined into one new thing. One thing that people oftentimes don't realize is that it's kind of hard to look at these different cultures if you're not familiar with them and be able to see exactly what it is for what it is. I think people have these viewpoints, and a lot of it has to do with stereotypes because they're not used to it. This idea is called Orientalism, and what it talks about is that people see an area as portrayed as romanticized or exaggerated, or how they've seen somebody else portray it, even though it might not be real. And so I thought it was cool in this video how the dancers are they're just normal people, just like you and me. Whereas if you were expecting to see a video of Indian dancing, you might expect bright colors and crop tops and lots of exaggerated clothing, when in reality those people live lives just like you and me. And so it kind of calls into question how Orientalism plays a role in all of our lives, because even if we don't mean to, sometimes it can take over, and it kind of starts to control those people when we put labels on them. And this happens in every direction. Orientalism was coined because of the way that people do this to Asian culture specifically, but it also happens for Polynesia, Africa. Actually, the same thing happens kind of vice versa on the West, kind of putting them into stereotypes and labels, and that one's called Occidentalism, but it's kind of the same concept. So I thought this video was really good at portraying that dance and those people for what it was, rather than what you'd think it was, even though a lot of people wouldn't have originally thought about it that way. But yeah, just like we've been talking about before, all of these parts of the world are so interconnected now just because of technology, and it's impossible to identify everything as in its like purest form. But we see globalization and mixing and blending everywhere in the world, and dance is such a great example of it. And sometimes people do it in a way that's really appreciative and respectful for all cultures. Sometimes people appropriate it, and that's a little bit of a different thing. But I think the important thing is to just be appreciative of like all the different cultures in the world, and look at the dances for what they are and how beautiful they are. And yeah, that's it.